So the first voting method that we're going to look at is called the plurality method of voting. Under this method, the candidate with the most first place votes will win, and that person is actually called the plurality candidate. Now at this point in time, we actually don't even need a preference ballot, which asks the voter to rank the candidates. We only need them to mark their first place choice. Okay, so that should sound very familiar. Out of a list of all the candidates, you just mark your number one. Now this method actually has many drawbacks. Other than its utter simplicity, it has very little else going in its favor. And so when we think about voting, this is what method I think a lot of people think about. They think about all the listed candidates, maybe putting that name on that piece of paper and then dropping it into the bucket. So that at that point in time, they're only voting for their first place. But really, it's actually plagued with a lot of problems. But first, let's just check out the mathematics of it and see what the plurality method says we need to do to figure out which candidate is going to win the election. So under our math club election, I've repeated the preference schedule right here. Now remember, we only really need the first place vote. So who the person voted for first, second, and third, we really don't need all this information. I just need my first place votes. So looking at this for candidate A, okay, so I'm going to run across here. Candidate A got 14 votes. Candidate B is listed right here, so they got 4 votes. Candidate C got 10 votes here, but 1 first place vote here. So they ultimately got 11 first place votes. And candidate D got 8 votes. So out of this, then we can figure out who is going to be the winner. So that's going to be Alicia. And we could also do a complete ranking where we list the candidates in order of first place, which would be Alicia, second place, so who had the next highest first place votes. So that would be then candidate C or Carmen. Third place then would be D or Dave. And then fourth place would be B or Boris. So you don't actually have to do a ranking unless you're asked for it. A lot of times if we just ask you for the winner, you'll just report who the winner is. Now before we go on, I want to clarify what's the difference between the plurality candidate. So that's the candidate with the most first place votes, and another candidate which is known as the majority candidate. The majority candidate will be the candidate with majority or more than half of the first place votes. So in this election up here for the math club, remember that we had 37 voters. Okay, and we can recover that information by adding up all of these numbers across the top. So for 37 voters, if we wanted majority or more than half, so let's figure out what 50% of 37 is. So that's going to be 18.5. So let's round that up. That means we would need 19 voters in order to reach majority. Notice in this election that nobody had majority. Nobody had 19 votes or more. Okay, so while in this election there was no majority candidate, okay, there was a plurality candidate. There was somebody that had more first place votes than anybody else, and that person was Alicia. Now, if your election only has 2 candidates, the plurality candidate will also be the majority candidate, so then everything's okay. Okay, so these aren't necessarily 2 different people. But if you have 3 or more candidates, there is no guarantee that you're actually going to have a majority. So maybe as another very simple example, let's consider looking at an election that had 100 voters. All right, so that means at that point in time, if I had majority, okay, then I would need then more than half, or 51 votes at least. Now, if you had only 2 candidates, so like your election would be maybe candidates A and B. So out of these 100 votes, they're going to have to be split up between these 2 people. So as an example, maybe A gets 51 and B gets 49. But very obviously someone's going to have more than half, because there's only kind of 2 buckets to put your votes in. But if you have, for instance, just even going to 3 candidates, okay, so let's call them A, B, and C. Okay, perhaps your votes in this case are split up 34, 33, and 33. Okay, so each of them gets roughly a third of the vote. So very obviously in this case, we do have someone who has plurality. They have more than anybody else. Okay, that would be candidate A, but we don't have someone who has majority. So that's going to be a very important concept to start distinguishing between the two.